Hey guys, this is Mike with Rolling Note Music, and I wanted to introduce you guys to a technique that I've been using for a number of years, which is basically mixing a virtual drum kit plugin like it is a real drum kit. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar with the DAW that I've used, if you haven't seen any of the previous videos, I use Studio One version 4. I have the professional edition, but many of the techniques that I'm using should transfer over to the artist edition. And for this instance, I'm going to actually use the most recent version of Steven Slate Drums, which is Steven Slate Drums version 5. But instead of going for the full crazy professional edition, which is just chock full of a bunch of drum kits, I'm actually going to show you the value of the free edition that is available on their website right now. Now, before we get crazy into this, one of the things that I wanted to make sure that you knew is that I am not endorsed by PreSonus or by Steven Slate. Not that I would mind either one of those. I'm just not currently endorsed by either of those companies, and I'm just doing this because I happen to like using both of these programs and to share this with you guys to show you that it is possible to be done with free and mostly stock plugins. All right, so the first thing you do after you start a new file is you load up the drum plugin. The plugin comes with like 2 or 3 basic kits, but the plugin itself is fully functional, and you're going to know what that means in a minute. Now, the full version of this plugin comes with just gigs upon gigs and kits upon kits, and it's fantastic and worth every single dime. But the free version gives you quite a bit to work with right out the gate without you having to pay anything. And I'm going to use that version to show you that every feature available in the full version of the plugin is also available in the free version. The only thing that's missing is all of the kits. But what comes with it sounds really good when you put it together. Now, I'm not as well versed in some of the other professional grade drum plugins like, Superior Drummer or Easy Drummer 2, but you should be able to translate the techniques that I'm using here with those plugins as well. All right, so the next thing you do, you load up your kit. We're going to go with the SSD5 free version this time. Wait for that kit to load up. All right, and we are good. All right, so the next thing we do at this point is we compose our MIDI track or our MIDI drum track. Now, for the sake of speed, I already have one set up and ready to go. It's got it's a little beat here with kick, snare, toms, hat, crash, so you kind of hear everything for versatility. Let's have a listen to it. All right, so we have our track composed. We have our kit loaded. Everything sounds good. It's starting up. And now we're ready to actually start doing our mixing. But before that, please make sure to click like if this video helps you out. Click subscribe for more videos too. And leave me a comment with any questions you have, and I'd be happy to answer them. All right, let's move on. So the idea of mixing a virtual drum kit like a real kit in a DAW is to actually treat the virtual drum kit like it is a real kit or as close as you can get it to be one. And in order to do that, for this step, we're going to open up the mix window, which is the button on the left here. Now, as you can see, this mixer is a pretty full-fledged mixer. It actually allows a lot of features. You got your volume, you got your pan. If you look in the upper portion of each drum, you've got dynamics control and all of this kind of stuff. However, for the sake of this video, what we're going to do is we're going to skip this mixer, and we're going to mix all of the individual outputs in the DAW itself. Now, the first step we're going to take to get to that point is at the bottom of each of these channels, you see a little output that says Out 1 Stereo. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to route all of these to their own outputs. Now, if you want to manually do this, you can click the little window itself, the text where it says Out 1 Stereo, and you can route it to any output that you wish. But we're going to head to this routing preset area over here on the left and click this black box underneath it. And here you see we have 3 settings. Right now, we are on everything on 1 stereo, and that means everything on 1 stereo output. The other options we have are everything on its own stereo and mono to mono, stereo to stereo. Now, the difference between these is how they treat each channel. Now, this is sort of tough to explain, so I'm going to try to do it crudely. Now, if you were to imagine this to be a real drum kit, the parts of the kit that use one microphone to capture the sound are considered mono. Examples of these would be kick, snare, each of the toms separately, hat, ride, etc. Now, stereo instruments would then be the overheads in the room. Now, the technical exception to this rule is the snare, which can use 2 mics technically, like you got top and bottom, but it's still normally considered a mono output since you wouldn't normally put the snare top and the bottom on different channels or separate channels like left and right unless you want a specific special effect. Now, I'm not going to get into the full logistics of this, but that's basically what you can assume here. Now, the next setting, which is called everything on its own stereo, mono instruments get a stereo send. And even though they're theoretically mono, since the outs are post-mix, the pan information is retained. So toms, hat, etc., everything still sits in its original stereo space based on the mixer that's in the plugin. So in review, mono to mono means mono instruments get mono outputs and stereo get stereo. Everything stereo, every output gets a stereo dedicated output itself, with pan information retained. Now it's your choice from here to decide what you want to do, but for this video, since I'm trying to be more akin to a real-world drum mix, I'm going to use mono to mono. Now you'll notice when I choose mono to mono, all of the mixer channels have changed to different numbers. This is because they've now been auto-routed to their own outputs from inside the plugin. However, we only have one fader in our mix window, and if you play it, you only hear the overheads. This is because the overheads are now routed to stereo output 1. So from here, we need to keep our plugin mixer open and head over to the left area of the mix window itself labeled Instruments and click on SSD5. Notice that an output menu drops down. From here, we click on the boxes matching the outputs labeled in SSD5's mixer to enable them. Now keep in mind, these will look somewhat out of order, so take it slow here to make sure that you match up properly. Also, to keep from getting lost, while you're enabling these outs, you need to label them right now. Here, 17 is kick, 18 is snare, and in SSD5, toms are labeled by size, but I like to number them 1 through 4, with 1 the smallest and 4 the largest. You do you. Now there's one extra thing that I do in this stage. I like to send the snare bottom to its own channel for independent control. So, find a spare mono channel output and route this snare bottom to that. I'm also going to do this with my kick out channel. Now on top of that, SSD5 has an SLR labeled output at the end of the mixer. This is a bleed control to the snare chain from the other instruments like toms and kick. It's nice to have control over this, and you can choose to avoid this part, but for added realism, I'm going to send this to the snare bottom as well. Again, you do you here. All right, so now we have all of our outputs set up and labeled. Now we organize them. So in this next step, we're going to put everything in place so it all makes sense, and then we're going to add subgroups. All right, so I'm going to have to stop this for just a second because it turns out I ran into a bit of a hiccup. It turns out in the signal routing for Studio One in relation to SSD5, in this case, the track numbers stay in their initial position, which means that output 17 has to come later than output 1, so on and so forth. So that means that everything is kind of scattered at this point. Now there's a couple of solutions that you can use to handle this, and I'm going to use one of them. Now the first one would be manually making sure that the tracks go in an order that you want. However, in this case, the stereo outputs come before the mono outputs, which means that overheads and room have to come before the kick and the snare and so on. Now, I don't personally like that, and because I'm being, weird and anal about it, I am going to actually do the other option, which is render all of the tracks to their own channels and then arrange those channels in the order that I want them to be. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is so that I am not lost trying to search for the snare bottom and the snare top 6 or 7 tracks apart from each other, in whatever case it may be, so that I can continue to mix and keep my eye on everything in a proper order. Now, I do not know if this feature is inherent in all DAWs. I just was unable to find a solution that allowed me to move these tracks around, aside from rerouting them to outputs that are not necessarily fully compatible with what I want to do here. So, as an alternative, just going over it again, I'm going to render these tracks to straight wave files. It's not going to really change the mix at all or what I'm doing. The only difference is I'm using pre-rendered tracks for each output rather than using the live outputs of the samples. This allows the samples to be more consistent rather than just randomized hits every single time. So I'm going to take a quick moment to do this, and we're going to continue. My preference for order is kick, snare top, snare bottom, toms small to big, hat, ride if you have it, which in this case we don't, overheads, and room. Next, select everything, right-click in the selection, and select Add Bus for selected channels. Do this on the whole kit first, and label this bus drums. Next, select your snare top and bottom and do the same thing. This bus will auto-send to the drums bus. Label this one snare. Now your snare tracks can be processed as both individual tracks for top and bottom and as a single track at the end of that chain. Do the same thing with your kick in and kick out. Label that one kick. Next, subgroup your toms. I normally don't do much here aside from monitoring my toms output as a group, but you can also add certain effects to the tom group as a whole if you want to. Okay, so now we have our main mix for organization with the snare and kick channels subgrouped, tom subgrouped, and a master drum bus for everything. Now we get to have fun and start mixing and adding effects. If you notice, I'm running a high pass on everything, by the way. I go over that in my last video as to why. Now, my initial philosophy here is to try to remove what's in the way before I augment what I want to come forward. So let's do this group by group. So we'll start with kick. I have kick in and kick out. Kick in is mainly for articulation and out is for the beefy thud. So for kick in, I'm going to add a gate and then an EQ. I'm going to set this gate to help with bleed and tighten without letting it sound choppy. Then I'm going to pull a decent amount of low mids and pull that low down a little. For kick out, we're going to set another gate and an EQ. For the EQ, I'm going to chop off the highs and use the lows exclusively. Then with the gate, I'm going to actually pull a sidechain signal from the kick in to trigger it. Now we set this for balance, and then kick group is where I add compression and add one more EQ just to sweeten it up a little bit. Now for snare top, I add an expander. I tend to find gates sound a bit too harsh and chop off a lot of articulation. Expanders help ghost notes pass through a little bit more. For snare bottom, I set a gate, I sidechain it from the top, and I bring the fader up to where I like it for now, but I tend to play with this fader as I mix. For the snare group, this is where I add compression and then EQ. Also at this point, I might add some light reverb, but I'm going to sit on that for now and move on. Next, toms. First, high pass, then expander or gate. This depends on the style. I might also forego this step in favor of manual editing in respect to live kits. Now with each tom separately, I open up the EQ and I find the fundamental note and then high pass just below that. Next, I compress it to taste. Then I add another EQ. This one, I scoop out all the low mids and kick up the 5K just a little bit for a snap. Now, I do this to all my toms individually while also watching their volume levels in the subgroup. It helps with placement and overall volume control. Now here I want to add something in relation to all the close mic drums that we have so far. In the case that you have a drastic dynamic change with kick, snare, or toms, like, you happen to have a hard hit out of nowhere, it might help to slap a limiter on those tracks in question in order to help stave off any large jumps in volume level. Next, we move on to cymbals. Now I know a few people that like to crush the living crap out of their cymbals and then high pass the snare out. I do not recommend this, and I'll tell you why. Now, high pass and compression are recommended, but think about this for a moment. When you hear a live snare, are you listening from right up next to it or like 6 feet away or more? Your snare needs air to breathe, or the body just disappears. The distance of the overheads are crucial to your snare's natural body. Leave your snare in. Now for this, I suggest a high pass between 150 to 250 hertz, give or take, and a light compression of about 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 to start. Also, don't be afraid of the high end of your cymbals. Let them shimmer. It's the difference between your mix sounding like a living, breathing performance and a wet cardboard box. Next, room. Now, there are a few things you can do here. You can compress, EQ some of the kick out, and pull the cymbals back and pull the fader up to taste. The higher the roomier, but you also sacrifice snap in the snare. I have a trick or two that I like to share. First, add an expander and a little reverb. We're going to sidechain the expander to the snare. This is going to allow the room to punch through when the snare gets hit. It also keeps the room out of the way of the kick, the toms, and the cymbals. In some instances, I like to do this rather than adding some synthetic sounding reverb to the snare, but I do this on a case-by-case basis. It depends on the song. And now the final step, the drum bus. This is where I like to apply the last bit of spit and polish. It's relatively minimal with light overall compression and analog EQ. And if you have it, light transient shaping. All right, now that we've gone through this, here's the original 2-channel mix. And here it is after multi-channel mixing. And that's it. If you have any questions, please leave me a comment and I'll be happy to answer you. If this video helped, please hit that like button and subscribe for more videos. Again, this is Mike from Ruling Up Music, reminding you to never compromise your sound.